This conference will now be
and
recorded.
Paul brings us a great perspective of kind of an overview of housing challenges that we face. And hopefully it'll start a good discussion. And so I do a version of this presentation pretty frequently. I speak to the Greater Syracuse Association of Realtors about 5 times a year. Realtors about the problems and challenges we face in Central New York related to housing segregation. And then I've also been doing this presentation for high school students, which has been really remarkable, and to hear their perspective and watch their reactions as they learn about our history, and how they learn how we came the way we are here in Syracuse area. Oh, and my clicker's not going to work. Uh-oh. Okay, so I think I'm going to stand up and use the mouse. I'm going to use the keyboard. All right, so I'll stand for the presentation part of it. I think everyone knows who Home Headquarters is and who the NYCLU is. So here is who CNY Fair Housing is. So we're a small nonprofit located, is this one on? Okay, located here in Syracuse. Is this one on? Okay. I'm just worried about feedback. Okay. I won't get too close. But we serve actually now 9 counties of Central and Northern New York. And we investigate complaints of discrimination and conduct undercover testing of housing discrimination. We provide counseling and advocacy and legal representation to victims of discrimination. We do a lot of education and outreach on fair housing rights and responsibilities, and a lot of research and policy advocacy to increase housing opportunity. It is 2019 and we still see a lot of housing discrimination. We see outright denials of housing for individuals, sometimes based on race and national origin. Most often what we see are individuals with disabilities and families with children who are denied housing. We see discriminatory evictions and lease non-renewals. Most frequently, we see differences in treatment of individuals in their housing searches, sometimes in the application and screening process, as well as after they've moved in to a property. We have housing providers who lie about the availability of dwellings, therefore making housing unavailable to those individuals. A lot of our cases are denials of reasonable accommodations or modifications for people with disabilities to allow them to remain in their homes. We see harassment and discriminatory statements made by housing providers. We investigate and have complaints of sexual harassment of women in housing by their landlords, including housing providers who demand trades of sex in exchange for rent or housing benefits. And we investigate and have complaints of evictions of victims of domestic violence. But all those individual cases, help shape our housing patterns, but only to an extent. We also try to address the bigger policy, big picture issues of persistent patterns, addressing persistent patterns of segregation and concentration of poverty, declining populations, leading to abandoned and substandard housing in our communities. And I'll say we serve 9 counties. It's not just we deal with these issues in a lot of rural communities and small cities as well. And we look at how we continue to invest in our community despite that fact that sprawl continues in spite of population stagnation and decline. So most of you are going to know a lot of this information coming forward in the next few slides. Syracuse has these remaining patterns of segregation that are stark and egregious. We are the 9th most segregated metropolitan area in the country by the last study. This is a racial dot map of the city of Syracuse, so identifies the population of the city by race and ethnicity. And so in this map, a blue dot is it equals 10 people. And I hate equating people with dots, but it does provide a visual representation of the issues related to segregation. So blue dot is Caucasian, red dots are African American, yellow is Hispanic population, and green is Asian population. And when you look at this map, it's obvious where the 81 is in this map, and the difference in terms of how 81 shapes our neighborhoods. And while the pattern of segregation is obvious in this map of the city of Syracuse, when you zoom out and look at all of Onondaga County, it becomes even more stark. The difference between the population within the city of Syracuse versus the county as a whole. And while there are, obviously scattered dots throughout the county of beyond the blue dots that are so obvious, it's hard to just even discern. Syracuse in central New York is also one of the worst scoring cities when looking at equality of opportunity based on race. This is just a shot of a study done by the Urban Institute on looking at different equality opportunity factors like homeownership, school test scores, employment gap, and then it rates our city, and we scored 97th out of 100 cities for equality of opportunity based on race. And we scored 92nd out of 100 cities for equality of opportunity based on ethnicity. We're one of only 5 cities that scored in the bottom 2 on both measures. And of course, we are the worst city in the country, and by city, I mean metropolitan area, when looking at concentration of poverty for Blacks and Hispanics. We're, I guess, number 1. I hate to say we're number 1 on this measure, but we're the worst city in the country. And if you look at this list, a lot of these communities are very similar to ours. Buffalo, Rochester, obviously, but also a lot of, with the exception of Fresno, California, which I'm not sure what's happening in Fresno, California, but with the exception of Fresno, all of the other cities are Northeastern or Midwestern Rust Belt cities. Here's the same chart for Hispanic concentration of poverty. And so every time I do this presentation, everybody always asks me why. Why are we, in the worst in the country on this measure? And so I encourage people to look at, what is similar about all of these other communities. And they're all communities whose population peaked around the same time in the 1960s and 70s. And so we are still largely shaped by the housing patterns that we had at that time in which our population peaked. And those housing patterns were largely shaped by discriminatory housing policies and practices, both by individuals as well as our government. So this is the redlining map of the city of Syracuse from 1937. The original redlining map done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in which they were trying to assess the ability to, the risk level of giving loans out in certain neighborhoods. So of course, green is the best area, blue is still desirable, yellow is definitely declining, and red is hazardous. And we have, so those neighborhoods that were redlined largely include, the 15th Ward, of course, the near west side, the west side, like Park Ave area, and then a stretch going out along where 690 is now. And so, of course, redlining, the reasons in which for a community being deemed red and hazardous to give loans in included all those factors that you'd expect, like the quality of the housing, whether there was industry, but it also included the racial and ethnic makeup of the neighborhood itself. And in the original redlining reports, that was one of the factors that they cited and specifically described in the original redlining reports. So I will say this is the language, I'm going to show you the original reports from 1937, which used the original language from 1937. But this is the actual redlining report for the 15th Ward from 1937. And in the description, they note the nationalities in the neighborhood and specifically talk about a shifting or infiltration of Jews and Negroes into the neighborhood. Nedrow also was a redline neighborhood. Nedrow, they specifically spoke about the infiltration of half-breeds into that neighborhood. The west side, or what exactly is this neighborhood called? Park Ave area. It's kind of the west side, but Park Ave, northwest side. Here they noted an infiltration of less desirables. And so individuals in these communities and these neighborhoods that were redlined could not get loans for their housing. They couldn't get loans for their businesses, and their housing started to decline as it would if you could not invest in that neighborhood. And so, of course, one option if your neighborhood is declining is to move out. However, at the same time, we started seeing the development of restrictive covenants that would prohibit white homeowners from selling their homes to Black residents. This is an actual restrictive covenant from a deed of a friend of mine, my friend's house, who recently sold their house in the University neighborhood, which was a green neighborhood. This was the actual deed of their house on Scott Ave that specifically said that during that aforesaid period, from the time the house was built, I think it held for 25 years from 1915 on, that the house could not be conveyed, could not be occupied or conveyed to African Americans as owners or tenants. And these existed, of course, throughout central New York, both in city neighborhoods in which that were green and blue neighborhoods, as well as in the developing suburbs at the time. If an individual was going to try to get a real estate agent to help them buy a house to maybe move out of a red line neighborhood, they would have trouble finding a real estate agent that would help them do that, because realtors at the time were required to take an oath in which they promised not to sell a house or specifically be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. I love reading this to the realtors because their jaws drop. They're so surprised by this, but they shouldn't be, because discriminatory practices still persist in the real estate industry, though they don't have to promise to discriminate as they did back up until the 1950s. So, of course, an individual could not move out of that neighborhood. You couldn't invest in the neighborhood. The housing starts to decline, and the federal government decides we need to fix these neighborhoods and address what they called slums and blight in those neighborhoods through urban renewal. And neighborhoods like the 15th Ward end up being demolished in the 1950s and 60s to make room for things like 81, but not just 81. I think a lot of times we think it's just 81. It's not. It's also the Everson, the Convention Center Garage, the Presidential Towers, the Civic Center, the Justice Center, the AXA Towers. That entire area was demolished. And in some of the blocks, it took 30 or 40 years for anything to be rebuilt. And the Convention Center didn't open until 1992 or 93, but that was demolished in the 1960s, and it sat empty. And after urban renewal, as we continued in our housing policy as both federal and state housing policy, we continued to locate all of our affordable and subsidized housing in the highest poverty neighborhoods. So while only 1/3 of all housing units in Onondaga County are in the city of Syracuse, 75% of the subsidized rental units are within the city. So it becomes obvious that we need to make a change in our housing policy as a country. And prior to the Fair Housing Act being passed, there was an attempt to desegregate public housing. So in 1962, there was an executive order to desegregate public housing that had previously been legally segregated. And they passed this executive order. However, a few years later, nothing had changed. Public housing remained highly segregated. And as they're debating the Fair Housing Act, so 1962 was when they issued that executive order. 1968, they're talking about the passing Fair Housing Act, which would apply to all private housing as well. And they were talking about why the executive order hadn't worked to desegregate public housing. And in the legislative record, they specifically said, I'll read this, the road to segregation is paved with weak intentions, which is a reasonably accurate description of the federal establishment today. Its sin is not bigotry, though there are still cases of bald discrimination by federal officials, but blandness, not a lack of goodwill, but a lack of will. They went on to say, when you ask one of these gentlemen, and they were referring to the Housing Authority directors, why, despite the 1962 Fair Housing Order, most public housing is still segregated, he invariably blames it on regional custom, local traditions, personal prejudices of municipal housing officials. The upshot of all this is a federal attitude of amiable apartheid, in which there are no villains, only good guys, a world in which everyone possesses the truth, but nearly everyone seems to lack a sense of consequences. And so before the Fair Housing Act, we had housing discrimination and segregation perpetuated outright, blatantly. People putting signs up like this in their neighborhoods, this one from Detroit in the 1940s. But of course, we are still highly segregated today. And why is that? How is it 51 years after passing the Fair Housing Act, we are still one of the most segregated communities in the entire country, and we still have these extreme differences in equality of opportunity and concentration of poverty? We still have housing segregation today, but now it is kind of perpetuated by proxy, by code words and buzzwords. So these are public responses to a proposal to build affordable housing in a suburban neighborhood. This was actually in the town of Cicero. And this was from 2016, so not very long ago. And this is what people said publicly. So, granted, what they said privately was probably worse. I happen to hear what some of them said privately. And what they said in the public petitions in response to the affordable housing is that they didn't want to be near a housing project. They said it would cause a potential increase in crime, and they were concerned about the type of people that it will attract to the area. And that I love this one, such projects could disrupt community cohesiveness and its underpinnings, which are essential to its health, safety, and stability. It sounds a lot like the language in the legislative record related to segregation of federal public housing about those local regional customs and traditions that kept public housing segregated. Now we're talking about our community cohesiveness and its underpinnings. This person obviously took themselves very seriously. One of the ironic things about this project is they actually, the single family houses in which there was a lot of the NIMBYism in response to this project, they had actually built their single family houses across the street from some affordable housing that had been there since the 1970s. They didn't know that they lived across the street this whole time from affordable housing. They lived across the street from a rural housing development that the USDA built in the 70s. And so they've been living across the street from affordable housing this entire time. And then when there's a new proposal to build workforce housing, it's suddenly a concern. I happen to be part of a discussion or hear a discussion of some of the community members who had been speaking out in opposition to this project. And they talked about things like how the families were going to have a lot of kids and it was going to be harmful to the schools, and they didn't want buses coming through because that would be horrible Centro buses, not school buses. School buses are okay, but Centro buses. But this is affordable housing, right? I mean, people are concerned about their property values. Surely they would not say the same thing about luxury housing, luxury apartments. These are the responses, again, the public responses to a proposed construction of luxury apartments in a suburban neighborhood in 2017. And what the individuals said publicly was that they didn't want to live in the city with the riffraff. They didn't want to deal with the bad things that those apartments would bring, and those didn't want to deal with those type of people with those type of problems. They said they didn't want transients walking through our neighborhood. And the owner of the property, in trying to be helpful, said that the opponents worried about transient apartment dwellers should consider the alternative. This is a deal far favorable to the building of factories or warehouses or Section 8 housing. So Section 8 housing becomes a proxy for everything undesirable. And the people's, I mean, Section 8 housing is somebody's home, and it's being compared to factories and warehouses. So this proposed project is in the village of Liverpool. It's about a mile from my house. And so the neighborhood next door, where there was all sorts of resistance to this, I know people who live in that neighborhood because the kids go to school with my kids. So I found out that what was happening privately was that there was individuals in the neighborhood that were passing around petitions and telling the neighbors that Somalis were moving into the neighborhood. And so they better sign this petition in opposition to these apartments because otherwise Somalis were going to move in nearby. And all I could think is we're still talking about an infiltration of people into our neighborhoods. It's still the exact same language as was used in 1937 in redlining reports. It's still the same fear of this infiltration that is controlling people's reaction to our housing policy and our housing developments. And then there's a lot more subtle ways in which these things are perpetuated. This is a sign at the CNY Home Show that was posted by a local home builder. And they had this on the screen behind their table, and that said that they're located in a safe neighborhood setting. And I thought, well, why would you say that? So I looked them up. Turns out their office is in the city, and they are signaling to anyone that might want to hire them to build a home that this is an okay part of the city. You can come to our office and plan your house because we're in a safe neighborhood setting. And it's obviously a concern. And it's a way that the housing industry and realtors do end up kind of signaling to individual homeowners and home buyers about what neighborhoods have value and what don't. We do still do housing testing in the real estate market. I will say we are seeing some evidence of discrimination still. And it's the smallest differences that often add up to a lot. It's the differences in who gets a callback and who doesn't. It's differences in just how friendly somebody is when someone comes to an open house. It's little differences in which houses someone's shown. And we still see that in our testing and today. So I know that isn't very hopeful. It's not, but I hope we can get to a hopeful place. So we're about to engage in two of the largest projects that our community's ever seen in terms of I-81 and Blueprint 15. Blueprint 15 would essentially address about a fifth of the subsidized housing, affordable apartments in the city of Syracuse, so obviously a huge scale. And I think with these projects, though, it comes a lot of opportunity to continue to address this legacy that we still live with. And with that, I will turn it over to Lanessa to talk about her work on that project.
Thank you, Sally, for that presentation. That was wonderful. And I think just a little bit about what the New York Civil Liberties Union is doing and how they're involved in housing equity surrounded by I-81 project. And so I think a lot of times when you hear about the I-81 viaduct, you don't necessarily think about housing equality or income equality or racial equality. But we're a civil rights, civil liberties law firm, and we see all these things being interconnected and making sure that while we do support the viaduct coming down and the community grid moving forward, it doesn't ensure that it's going to be an equitable community grid. It doesn't ensure that some of the past harms that Sally mentioned will be addressed in this new project. And one of our biggest fears is through this new project, there's going to be 5 to 7 acres of land that become available once the viaduct comes down. And what does that look like for the neighborhood that currently sits there? And so what we know about that neighborhood, as Sally mentioned, is that neighborhood has the highest concentration rates of poverty in the neighborhood. 1 out of 3 children in that neighborhood are below the federal poverty line. That has the highest rates of asthma, COPD, respiratory disease in our county because they're adjacent to a viaduct. Some of those homes are 3 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet away from the viaduct, and they have been there for the past 55 years. And so what we're looking to do is say, how can this project benefit those individuals who were harmed in the past by state and federal policies? And how can they benefit in the future by this new community grid, and making sure that they're included in the conversation and their needs, wants, and desires are heard. And so a part of what we're doing is we're starting a comment campaign where we're canvassing the neighborhoods every Saturday, and we're hosting workshops on Tuesdays and Thursdays in those neighborhoods. And we're saying, what do you want your neighborhood to look like? What are some of the things you want to see in your neighborhood? As a result of that, we were able to come up with about 15 stickers. We're making it as easy as possible for individuals in that neighborhood to submit comments to the DOT. Now, just to take it back a little bit, the Department of Transportation, they've already come out with their preferred option, the community grid. I think most of us know that here. It's a 15,000 page document. I'm almost finished reading the document, so I have a very good idea of what's in that document and what's not in that document. And what we learned, what's not in that document is, even though in the historic section, they talk about the things that Sally addressed. They talk about the racial divide. They talk about the inequities. They talk about the displacement of 1,300 people. During the I-81 construction, 400 to 500 homes and businesses were destroyed to make way for the highway. And this destruction started in the mid-1950s. The federal government did not have a relocation plan until 1961. So there is hundreds of people, thousands of people who were displaced with no relocation plan. And what did that look like? Well, we've interviewed several people who live in the 15th Ward. It wasn't that long ago. They're still alive. And what we found is, because they weren't being told anything, they were moving from block to block to block, not understanding their entire neighborhood was being disseminated. So you're talking about loss of wealth, loss of home ownership, loss of stability, loss of jobs, because they would move from Madison Street to 1 block over. And then 2 weeks later be told, oh, you have to move out of here too. Then they would move from that street. I mean, we've talked to several people who have moved 7, 8 times during this construction phase, not understanding the breadth of the construction. Businesses that closed down and were never able to recover as a result of the destruction. And so while DOT does talk about the historical aspect, what they do not do is incorporate that into their plan at all. They do not address how they're going to kind of create any kind of restorative justice or any kind of analysis of how they're going to improve the lives of the individuals that were harmed in the past, and or the ones that live along the viaduct now, because they didn't have the income to move away. It was very simple. When the viaduct came up, if you had the amount of money to move, you moved. No one wanted to voluntarily live near a viaduct. And as a part of the 1961 relocation plan, what the federal government did is they gave grants to white residents of the Syracuse Housing Authority to buy homes, and they moved the Black people into the projects. And so that was their idea of a relocation plan. So I think it's important to know people who had homes, who owned homes, were now relocated into a Syracuse Housing Authority. At the time, the Syracuse Housing Authority was majority white. Okay, it like made the paper when one Black family moved in, and it was like 1949. Okay, and so they started moving in Black people into the Syracuse Housing Authority and giving grants to white folks to move out to the suburban area as a result of this new highway that made it very accessible for them to have access to areas outside the city. And now we see one of the most segregated areas in the nation. And what do those restorative things look like? So some of the things are, well, we know that the highway's been sitting there giving off exhaust and fuels and lead for 55 years. And so we're asking that they do a soil remediation for the entire area. What does that look like? That means DOT would be in charge of measuring the soil, the pollutants in the soil, and if they find them, remediating them, right? Storm windows, central air, power washing their houses. I mean, bringing them back up to a standard that they would not have had if they weren't along a viaduct that was built in their backyard. Other things that we're asking for is creating a relocation plan. While the DOT is claiming that they can do this entire project with people living 7 and 10 and 5 feet away from their homes, we're saying, well, what if people don't want to live in an unbearable situation for 4 to 7 years? What if they don't want to live in an area 10 feet away from a $2 billion construction project? What if they're suffering from health conditions and they don't think they're going to make it through a 4 to 7 year construction project with the dust and the fumes and the lead that's coming down with that viaduct? And so we're asking for a comprehensive relocation plan. And I mean, there's 15 stickers on there. And what I would ask of you is every time I come to speak at an event, it's a call to action. And we have postcards and stickers back there. If you could complete a postcard before you leave, sign your name and your address on the front. It doesn't matter where you live. We just really need to speak to the DOT with one voice. And we need to say, this is an issue of concern in our neighborhood. What we want to see is everyone benefit from the community grid and not just a few. And we want to kind of make sure that this can actually be a thing that stitches the neighborhood back together. And actually everyone can come out of this and say, you know what, this was the best thing for our city and our children's children will benefit from this. What we don't want to see happen is those individuals be marginalized and pushed further to the south. The DOT in their plan say that there's going to be 5 to 7 acres of land and it'll be ideal for luxury housing. That's their words, not mine, ideal for luxury housing. Now, when we hear luxury housing, what do we think? We think white folks, gentrification. We think the rents, the taxes around that neighborhood are going to go up, so it could essentially push people out because now you have a desirable luxury housing facility, and then you also have a Syracuse Housing Authority, and then not to mention the 500 homeowners that live along the side of the viaduct. What's going to happen to their taxes? What's going to happen to their insurance? What about their renters? Are their rents going to go up? Another thing that we've highlighted in the DOT is they're going to be doing a lot of easements on property, but they're not identifying the properties that they're going to require easements from. We know it's going to be the Black and brown communities. With those easements, the homeowners will get some type of compensation. The only problem with that is 84% of those people are renters. And so now we think about if the homeowners are going to get compensation for easements on their properties, is that going to trickle down to the renters? Are they going to say, oh, we'll cut $300 a month off your rent? I doubt it. And there's nothing in place to ensure it. And so now we have a situation where renters who are already living in poverty, who are already having all these other issues going on in their life, will now have to deal with easements on their property of big construction sites. And so those are some of the things that we're looking to the DOT to correct and include in their plan before the EIS comes out, which is the final environmental impact statement. And if this doesn't happen, we're really afraid that the area will be gentrified and people who are already marginalized will be further marginalized, and this problem will just perpetuate.
So much for hope. Yeah, hope. It's not too late.
Wow, it's hard to follow, but excellent take on the whole situation. I guess, sitting here, Sally's presentation and hearing Lanessa's kind of upfront look at the draft EIS, which I have not read the 15,000 pages, and Blueprint 15 and whatnot. I guess what I was thinking about and can offer is kind of a broader perspective, like a 30,000 foot look at policies and programs. And I really thought that Sally's presentation was well ordered. So she showed the dot map showing the existing situation as it is right now, both in the city and in the county, and the obvious segregation that is, whether it's de facto or de jure, meaning on purpose or by accident, it is what it is today. And I tend to think, and I think we up here all agree, that it's not by accident. This is the result of decades of misguided policies and programs. And I'm kind of bifurcating the two. They kind of seem one and the same. But for example, the FHA underwriting standards that Sally showed, that map that created the term redlining, I look at as a policy that was in place for decades that guided the lending policies of banks, locally and nationally for decades, and resulted in disenfranchisement of large swaths of this community, which again, over 80 years, that footprint of disenfranchisement is still in place. So I look at that as a horrible policy that is no longer in place, but yet nothing's moving it backward. Nothing's undoing that policy. We just said, oh, okay, we're just going to stop doing that right now. But we're left with the results of decades of that policy. And then I think of things in terms of programs too. And urban renewal, Sally touched upon as well. It was kind of a federal program of slum clearance, and the federal government's going to come into this neighborhood and clear the slum and build. It wasn't typically new housing, as Sally said. It was more highways and museums and ballparks and whatnot. And those programs, had policies within them, but were also misguided too, and almost reinforced the segregation that we witnessed in this country for almost 100 years. So why do again, looking at it from an academic approach, here we are on the precipice of two huge programs, as Lanessa mentioned, the I-81 and the Blueprint 15, and yet we're still also talking about reforming some policies too, in that area. So the urban renewal, the Blueprint 15 has a lot of, it brings to mind the urban renewal approach. And I'm not saying that it is, but it's like this very strategic look at a very distinct geography and how federal and state funding is going to alter that geography in a significant way. That can be for good and for bad. We just have to thank God for folks like Lanessa that are kind of watching how these programs are rolled out, and a lot of people in this room I should give credit to. I'm looking at Peter too, that are kind of keeping an eye on how these the renovation of 81 into the community grid, and again the Blueprint 15 that expands from east to west. We just need to ensure that the programs that they are rolled out in an equitable way and are very cognizant of the past and the history that we all just heard about. And then we also should think about policies today that need to be relooked at and tweaked. And what comes to mind, and I think I was talking to someone in the hallway about next week, there's going to be a zoning discussion. And the city's on the precipice of redoing its entire zoning ordinance, which was originally brought into the city around 1920, and how that policy has also contributed to the concentration of poverty and concentration of minorities in different parts of the neighborhood. So I don't have any specific recommendations, but I kind of offer that in terms of guidance of these programs, and knowledge is power here, where I think I should read that 15,000 page DEIS, or all of us should be familiar with it. Attend these meetings, just be involved in the rollout of what will be a years long efforts but also think about your world and the policies that, whether they're municipal or state or federal or private, that also shape where we live, how we live in this community, and think of that equity through with that equity lens. Like, is this policy, is it fair on its face? And does it result in long-term equitable situations for everybody in this community? So I guess I'll stop there and maybe we'll open it up.
I think we can open it up for questions. I just want to add that I have to believe that this can be done right, that we can do this and move forward and rebuild this neighborhood in an equitable way. And I'm an optimist just by nature. But I also think like there's an urgency to it. Very soon it will be too late. So there is an urgency to be working to addressing that now. Whether it means making sure that there is other housing available for people who are displaced out of that neighborhood soon, beginning those other projects, or making sure that the state includes in their final policy, their final EIS, all of the things that that the people living in that neighborhood deserve. I think with that, we'll open it up to questions. Peter.
I'm wondering what the potential for mixed income housing is, and I'm thinking, are the folks who are providing the capital for development, are they framing incentives for developers to pursue that, or are there other policy that could be put into? It's probably it wouldn't be appropriate, I guess, for the zoning code, but are there interventions that might, heighten the potential for mixed income housing?
Well, I think one, it can be appropriate for the zoning code. There are communities who have mixed income zoning requirements where any new housing must have a certain percentage of affordable housing. So there are communities that do that. We have attempted to use things like, pilot agreements as a way to incentivize affordable housing. The city has in the last couple of years, but nobody has actually done that yet. So no developers have taken that on. New York State allegedly supports mixed income housing, and in their for their low-income housing tax credit program, for example, which is the low-income housing tax credit program, is the primary means by which affordable rental housing is built nowadays. Mixed income is incentivized, but not to the extent that it needs to be, because it still is not happening. Like, we still have not seen, really, we're not seeing mixed income housing being built in Syracuse the same way it is in some other communities. So the incentives are still not there sufficiently. I think given that this is a state project with 81, I mean, what a great time for the state to say, hey, we're gonna really put our money where our mouth is on this, and we're gonna, put in a massive investment in mixed income housing. And but I haven't seen that yet. Waiting for it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask a question, if I may jump in here, about what is your expectations about the reality of a highway project being able to accomplish some of the things you have. Is there any track record, whether it is in New York State or other projects nationally, where the highway project has taken some responsibility to solve some of these legacy problems with it?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that question. So a lot of times people think because we're dealing with the Department of Transportation and it's a highway project, it's primarily about transportation. And that's probably a very, very misconception of what transportation means or what a highway project means. And so transportation, the highway projects, DOT, they are designed around economic development and movability to get people around via walking, biking, busing, or driving, and spurring economic development, and also creating neighborhoods. As a part of the original build, the sell wasn't, we're going to have an easy way through the city of Syracuse. The sell was, we're going to create an infrastructure that's going to allow your city to become bigger. And so that was a sell. What we didn't expect is that the suburbans would break off and become their own people, and then now we have like the suburbs versus the city. What we expected was it was going to create more land for people to be able to go develop suburban neighborhoods. And so that was a part of the local sell for the highway. So it's not about transportation. It is about those things that we talked about. And if you look at DOTs in New York City, they've done this exact thing. If you look across the state, I mean the nation, DOTs have done this kind of thing. And I think you'd be surprised at what kind of things they actually do address. Some DOTs, when done correctly, through interagency collaboration. So I'll give you an example. So there was a DOT project down in Minnesota, and there was already a problem with transportation, public transportation. And so a part of what their interagency collaboration, which means they're central, and the DOT decided is they're going to create these light rails all across the city to make sure people have access through the bus system to get back and forth to work. Now, what happened was that DOT donated like $3 or $4 million for this project to happen. If we look at places like Colorado, where there isn't a lot of affordable housing, they decided we're going to build up affordable housing for people to move into as a result of this construction. And people who don't want to live in affordable housing, but they want to live in something comparable to where they live now, they can move into a different apartment or they can move into a different home, and we'll pay the difference of what their rent or mortgage was for 42 months to make sure that we're easing the note of construction and or the damage that it caused in the past. So there are examples of restorative justice. There are examples of going far beyond what we think transportation would include. Now in Syracuse in central New York, this is our project, and we haven't had a project like this except for the original build. And so asking people to think outside the box and say, we need to be asking for bigger and for more. This is a $2 billion project. Right now, the community grid is slotted to cost $1.3 billion. So we know there's a buffer there for mitigations. And so what does that look like? And coming up with an equitable way, this is what it should be. So yeah, there is.
There's actually an economic component to the Department of Transportation. I think you said that it's part of their mandate to do some of the remediation.
Yes. So they have their. I'll give you a perfect example. So on the north side of Syracuse, the original plan that they had a few years ago was to have these flyover bridges. The small businesses on the north side got together and said, we don't like these flyover bridges. They're going to look terrible in our neighborhood, north side up. And we want it changed. And so a part of, in the DOT, in the current DEIS that was written just a few, 7-8 weeks ago now, it says, we're going to spur economic development on the north side by creating these walkable bridges where people can ride their bikes, they can walk, they can drive. And we're also going to create new roads so people have more access to opportunities to spur economic growth. And so they're citing these things in certain parts of the city, so we know it's possible. It's just a fact of, from what we look at, from the policies that happened in the past, what are they doing to ensure that those type of opportunities are everywhere amongst the project?
But that's the only one currently, as far as you know, is the north side.
That yeah, so when you talk about changing the actual style of the viaduct, I mean, they actually changed the design of the highway. So you have the engineers who worked 10 years to come up with this design, and then individuals got together and said, we don't like this design, it's going to hurt our business. And they said, okay, well, we'll change the design for you, which is huge.
Go ahead.
I just have a question in terms of, in regards to economic development, the workforce, because that seems like that's going to be the bottom line, the development costs and housing costs. And it's still going to create an issue where I'm assuming new development, the rents, and what it costs to live, and the newly developed projects that are coming up for the community. I mean, there's still an issue with jobs, workforce, and are they going to still be able to afford? I know Buffalo, Rochester went through some issues, and they have a huge homeless epidemic in terms of the people still being able to afford to move back, or so I'm the workforce. How is that going to impact the people who are moved out? I mean, it's
Sure. I mean, obviously the whole project will spur economic development, whether it is because it opens up land or just because we're looking at having well over $1 billion spent in our community. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of jobs for individuals, hopefully individuals who have traditionally not been able to be part of the workforce. I know there's a lot of course, initiatives to try to prepare and make sure that jobs are going to individuals in the city in particular, and make sure they have the skills to take on those jobs. I don't know if this project would be enough for us to, kind of raise standards of living and incomes enough to really alter neighborhoods. My primary concern is what replace the affordable housing and particularly public housing that is currently in the neighborhood, or what goes in the land that becomes available. And is there housing as part of redevelopment? That's where my primary concern is in terms of pricing people out of the neighborhood, is what actually goes back in there. And Paul, I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about just an overview of like what really are our affordable housing needs in our community. Because I think it's, one of the advantages of being a smaller city is it's actually maybe doable and to actually address affordable housing needs that we have here, and maybe how we can move what existing programs we have to try to move the needle on opportunities for affordable housing.
Sure. Well, you may have heard, read in the paper every year or so that Syracuse is one of the most affordable housing markets in the country. And, we always kind of seem to end up on that list. And yet affordability and quality is not factored into that equation. So we have a housing stock that, again, Sally referenced in her presentation, that was built for a population of 220,000 people, which is what we had in 1950. And now we have 145,000 people. So a lot of people left, but the housing stock stayed, and a lot of it fell into disrepair because no one was investing in it. So we have affordable housing per se, but it's not livable housing. It's not, you can't live in the housing that's affordable. Now the housing that is online, people are paying obscene rents in this town, far above what most homeowners pay in the suburbs as a percentage of their income. And we call that, the cost burden for renters is extremely high in this city. And it seems like an oxymoron in a city that has an excess of housing, but that is in fact the case. That there's so little quality housing that the price for that housing is higher than it should be. So yeah, we got the worst of both worlds in that sense. So what do we do about it? Well, one of the biggest things that Home Headquarters tries to do is get people into a home ownership situation so that they're actually building equity when they're paying their monthly housing costs. They're not paying it to an absentee landlord downstate or wherever, that they're actually paying themselves. But to make that leap from renter to home ownership is not easy when you don't have, the credit that's needed or the job or the income and it goes back to, credit worthiness or more, getting people prepared for mortgages, which generally what we do all day long at home headquarters. About 800 people a year come in and take a 8-hour class that gets them ready, mortgage ready. And it's been going on for 20 years and there's still the capacity to increase our home ownership rate, which is, by the way, only about 40% of the housing in this city is owner occupied. The rest is renter occupied. So I think that's the biggest thing that we can work on is a lot of the renters that fall within that 60% could and would be paying less on a monthly basis if they in fact own their housing. But the reservoir of quality housing for them to purchase is not huge. In fact, it's lacking, and the tools to get there are still lacking. But
is there any funding possibly coming forth so that financing can go into, let's say, land bank? Right now, even how that's ran through people purchasing it with cash, is there any supplement or any help financially? Because it's hard to get a mortgage on a house that's under a certain amount. And is there money coming in or a grant being allotted so that people can purchase these homes so that they could pay less than they would? Because I tell people all the time, you could do better owning and be paying the same you'd be paying for rent.
Yeah. So excellent question. And, again, I was very much involved in trying to get the land bank up and running. And I think the promise of the land bank was, let's turn this dilapidated housing into owner occupied situation so that everyone can own a home. And the reality is not as rosy. Where we are with the land bank right now, it's about 5-6 years old. And it's the recipient of seized housing by the city. The city goes in and takes your house if you haven't paid taxes, and hands it to the land bank, and the land bank's responsible for disposing of that in some way, selling it. But it boils down to quality again. The housing stock that's in that bundle of seizures is the lowest rung of the quality of the housing stock that we have.
What's the bones though?
They have great bones. You're right, and the architecture is excellent. But think about if someone doesn't pay their taxes for 2-3 years and gets to the point where they're seizable, they're also not putting a roof on the house, or they're also not putting a furnace in the basement. And so you have the oldest housing stock in the region, which is in the city, and actually in the inner ring neighborhoods of the city. So 100-year-old houses haven't been invested in for decades, seized by the city, handed to the land bank, and then say, hey, new homeowner, here you go. And connecting that person or the new homeowner, prospective homeowner, with financing is really the key. But it's really, to answer your question really quickly, there's really no set aside subsidy to help that person, the prospective home buyer, really make the improvements that they need to make that house livable. So the majority of the housing is going to landlords that have, or investor owners, as we call them, that have the capital to put in these houses. And that's not a horrible thing. There's a lot of good landlords out there that are that do provide quality housing. But it's different than the promise that we had thought when we were going to, hopefully all this housing stock will be going to owner occupants. And we do need probably a line of subsidy just for the people that you're talking about, prospective home buyers that need not just a loan, but some sort of grant to take care of the disinvestment or to address the disinvestment of these houses that have been neglected for so long.
I just want to add one. I've been doing this presentation for high school students, and I show them something from 1937. They don't understand why I would talk about something that happened so long ago. And I mean, of course, these are all kids now were born after 2000. And so then when I tell them is actually the same, it's still the same houses themselves, the actual physical structures that were redlined or yellow lined, because even the yellow line neighborhoods are really continue to have suffer from disinvestment. Then they kind of understand, and they're shocked, like, wow, that's still the actual houses that we're talking about.
You stated that if you're a homeowner, if you own a house, you're actually paying less monthly than renting. And did you come up with that figure when you figured the total cost, including paying taxes on that home?
It's a generalization for sure. But it does, I probably provide you with a slew of studies that point to the mortgage, insurance, and taxes are really the cost of home ownership. And on average, that is less than renting, so.
Think about the downtown luxury housing. One bedrooms downtown are going for $1,250, right? And that's just the one bedrooms. 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms can go up to $3,000. We're talking $3,000 to live Syracuse downtown. And so what Paul is talking about is like absolutely correct. If you're paying $3,000 a month for downtown, then 4 blocks into the west side, that landlord feels like you should be paying $2,000 for his rundown, beat up 3 bedroom, because just on the block, the rent is $3,000. And so that's what we're seeing happening all across Syracuse as these landlords are raising their rent, comparing them to the luxury housing that's nearby.
Is rezoning though, isn't the rezoning going to have that kind of impact where now you can, or no, I'm thinking wrong. Like they rezone it, so now market rents that were for one area, it's not going to have that impact? I thought
No.
it does. Okay.
Well, there's the HUD fair market rent, which is determined by HUD for establishing payment standards for vouchers, for Section 8 vouchers. But otherwise, the market rent is really the market. Yep. It's what people will pay. Right. So there was just an article about the fact that Syracuse rental housing prices just went up 10% year to year in Syracuse. Yeah, it kind of snuck by on Syracuse.com last week. The third highest increase in the entire country in the city of Syracuse, but 10% increase year to year in rental housing, yes.
That's the same thing happening in the Chaplin district. I can get back and forth from Syracuse to Albany, and we're going to take the best of what's happening in Syracuse, the best what's happening in Albany, and set them as models for Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo. There's lead cities that came out. They have a foundation, but getting the developers, the buy-in has been an issue because we call it PSI, personal self-interest, like the developers on the north side don't see the developers on the south. They see it's competition as opposed to a collaboration. But in regards to Syracuse DOT, local people see it as a local issue, whereas DOT has said it's a regional issue because it encompasses at least 5, 10 different states because of 81 and 90. So it's a much bigger picture, but to make sure it's inclusive of those who are less able to afford transition has been what we've been working on in New Albany in planning and urban policy, and it ties back into the immigrant communities because you got all these people coming into America. They go to New York, and like you said, the rent for a 1 bedroom is now $3,000-4,000 in Brooklyn. So they come up to Albany and say, "Wow, you're only paying $1,200," and the greedy landlords, that's where the code enforcement comes back in. They're not fixing up the building. They're absorbing as much money as they can, not as many dilapidated properties, and they're not doing quality work. Instead of repairing the buildings, they're just patching them up just enough to do the minimum. Recently, there's a best practice that was enacted by it's Department of State for code enforcement. So when they do plan reviews, they're doing it based on best practice as opposed to the minimum code. I can't stand slumlords because they patch it up, charge the rent, and this allows developers to charge more rent. And that's where the one who did the comprehensive plans for Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, Clarion, they did not include affordable housing because it would scare off the developers. And that's the buy-in, getting developers who embrace sustainability. They can make more money over the life cycle as opposed to that they're fast up, but same thing with solar. People can't afford that initial down payment. But if they could, people will benefit the most, the ones who can least afford it. So that's what they're working on at the Rockefeller School of Policy, and you all be planning some of the departments how to make that happen and give real models.
So I will say, I mean, to the city's credit, they have been making a lot of changes to address housing quality and improve code enforcement. Paul, which I give Paul a lot of credit because he started with the Bureau for Administrative Adjudication that should improve compliance with code enforcement, and that's just getting going. So I'm hoping, we're hopeful that that's going to make a huge difference in terms of getting landlords to be compliant and take better care of their properties. So, yes, you had a question.
No, actually, this gentleman came in before or after our introduction, so I was wondering, sir, can you introduce yourself? Do you mind? We missed the opportunity.
I was a little bit late, had to do all of me. I was talking to Paul. That's why I was late coming. Had to do all of me.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just, as we're talking about some of these issues, that I was at the city hall a couple weeks ago when they failed to pass the good cause legislation, which was really quite upsetting because you can, and I'm also have been involved with another group that has been focused on like paint in the city, and you can complain about the cracks and the peeling paint and still be evicted. And those things are all tying in together when it comes to providing quality housing for lower income people. And I'm still not trying to understand why that got pulled out of line.
Well, and good cause did not get included in the bill that actually passed in Albany 2 days ago. So good cause was not part of the compromise rent reform package. I think, as far as with good cause, I think we tweak it and try again. It was a, relatively new concept, and sometimes it takes time to figure out how to address concerns that were raised with that. And so we'll, try next session. But it did pass in DeWitt. Yeah. So the city of Syracuse, it was a resolution by the city council in support of the rent reform packages that were being considered in Albany. So it was, and it failed to pass in the city council. So the rent reform packages included rent control, which would expand rent control to upstate cities if they opted in, if they had a 5% vacancy rate or greater, as well as good cause eviction. And then they actually did vote on it in Albany, and did pass the expanded rent control, but good cause eviction did not get included in that. And that was passed Tuesday, I believe, Wednesday. Yes.
Is there anything being done with Section 8, the home ownership policy with the city? And are we meeting any minimums through the Empower program for energy efficiency? And additionally, one more point of information. The Public Service Commission has an order out to do stray electricity assessments on the utilities in cities over 50,000. And Syracuse is being completely ignored And it is blowing things out of the water all over the city, including our water pipes. And we're being completely ignored. But homeownership is Section 8 empowerment.
Yeah, there is in fact a federal program that allows you to turn your Section 8 voucher into home ownership. You're absolutely right. So my second phrase to that is it's all about implementation at the local level, awareness, and not being critical of the housing authority. It's really their responsibility for the vouchers that they what do you say? Okay, well, yeah, no, and it really, and to me, it's an issue of awareness and promoting that through the housing authority. And I think they've done a pretty lame job of letting people know of that option.
They don't even acknowledge its existence when they're called upon.
No, it's.
They literally treat you like you're an idiot if you ask about it.
That's an example of a policy that we need to fortify and strengthen, because it's there. The rule is there. It's just, so we don't need to pass any new legislation. We just need to take advantage of the existing one. And that is, a detriment at the local level that we need to, I'm glad you brought it up, bring in, because the housing authority is the owner of the entire Blueprint 15 or the majority of it. So
and when we do get people to actually buy these outside of the Section 8 program, they should be able to assess the energy efficiency of the house, because if they're going to wind up with a $2,000 a month bill and utilities trying to keep a drafty old house warm, they're not going to be able to afford the $200 a month mortgage payment.
Right. That's where the energy code enforcement is coming in with best practice. Now, building inspectors, I was at the training about 3 months ago. They have to look at that energy component. It's just trickling down.
The banks do not, if they're just giving you a loan for a mortgage.
That used to be the rule, but because in order to get a permit, the building inspectors are supposed to make sure that the energy efficiency is a part of whatever they're doing in their design. If it's not there, they're supposed to put it on hold.
And there are 2% loans available for energy efficiency, which actually reduce the overall default rates.
I mean, I think, just that, with regards to the Section 8 homeownership program, it shows an example of an opportunity, missed opportunity for us. And one of those opportunities that we can no longer afford to ignore. And I think it's one of those areas. This is low hanging fruit in central New York, and we shouldn't be. We can't keep passing by that low hanging fruit and expect to solve our problems, particularly as we engage in these large projects. Our time is up, so I want to wrap up. I thank you all for your time, and I thank Paul and Lanessa for willing to join me again, and I'll probably drag them out for some more things soon. So thank you, John, for the invitation.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. It was a wonderful presentation. I think it's probably only going to be the first of a number, because there are so many questions here. I think this is a very big topic. I have probably a half a dozen questions that I didn't get a chance to ask. Hopefully we can get you to come back in the fall and continue this very important conversation. So thank you very much for being here.
Housing scoped out.
Are you city resident right now?
I actually know about the area.
And you've been attending apparently some city meetings about this Section 8 issue? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Thank you. Yes.
And the stomach.
Yes. Yes.
And right now, we're treating it like the bowels.
Now, would you, I'm so unfamiliar, this is what Section 8 is referring to. What looks like closet?
Section 8 home ownership.
That's good. Okay, I only think it's